20 scandalous stories of Wild West saloon girls' forbidden affairs. Saddle up for a ride through the Wild West's juiciest scandals. Get ready to uncover 20 tantalizing tales of forbidden affairs between saloon girls and their mysterious paramours. This is one journey through history you don't want to miss. Number 20. A Tale of Mrs. Lake's Home. During the massive highway project, construction crews excavated a site called Mill Pond, which in 1828 had been filled in when the city needed more space to expand. Crews found a sealed, wood-lined privy, the underportion of an outhouse, filled with items that begged for further inspection. During the 19th century, before the advent of municipal trash collection, privies were used not only as toilets, but for general household waste disposal. Because of limited funding, Massachusetts officials stipulated at the time of the Big Dig that the state would pay to study only those excavated items believed to have been manufactured before 1830. Recognizing the item's historical significance, archaeologists working for John Milner Associates, the firm that excavated the Mill Pond site, cleaned and stored them. And that's where Beaudry and her students became involved in the project. While not part of the actual excavation, Beaudry had heard about the surprising finds from former student Ellen Birkeland, the archaeologist for the city of Boston. Beginning in 2008, Beaudry and several of her students began to study the excavated items for a research analysis class and as a thesis project for some of them. Beaudry and her team pieced together a fascinating recreation. The madam managed to create an atmosphere that mimicked the middle-class home, she says. This kind of brothel was referred to as a parlor house because there were furnishings that sort of looked like a middle-class parlor. The brothel offered special kinds of entertainment like gambling, meals, and special services, which would take place in a private room for an extra cost. This the team was able to deduce from the many different dinner and tea sets, which suggests that the home was able to serve several different clients at once. Johnson's research showed that at the time, most of the young women who worked as prostitutes in cities came from predominantly rural areas, probably to find work in the city. To them, it seemed like a place of opportunity, Beaudry says, but many of them were forced into the low-end brothel houses or, even worse, street walking, because that was the only way they could make any kind of living. While prostitution was illegal, she says, policemen often looked the other way. In fact, city records show that a policeman lived at the lake property while it operated as a brothel. Number 19. Nothing is private about sex. Sex in the Wild West wasn't all about two people camped out in a bedroom and getting naughty between the sheets. In fact, it was the exact opposite, as it was more common for multiple families to share a house or large room, which meant there was a lot of partner sharing or sex without much privacy. Having more space meant having more money, and those in the Wild West often didn't, meaning shared rooms or houses and finding strategic ways to get off. It was common in the Wild West for families to live in small houses, usually made up of one large room. So, naturally, when it came down to every member of a family sharing one space, privacy wasn't possible. In which case, it's fair to question how they would get intimate when sleeping in a bed with children or other relatives. Writing on the development of privacy and adult pleasure as a private practice in Europe, author Brian Watson explained that during the Reformation, figures such as Martin Luther created a sanctity of privacy surrounding intimacy, something previously non-existent. In the United States, this type of privacy was afforded by class. Money meant privacy, and most in the Wild West didn't have any money.
Hey!
Pretty nice.
Yeah, well,
Oh, yeah.
get the whole outfit here. Huh?
Number 18. Saloon girls' issues with family, alcohol, and drugs. Because working girls had easy access to alcohol and drugs, it was not difficult to become addicted to either one. As author Jeremy Agnew points out, the incidence of mental depression was high among prostitutes, so many of them turned to drugs and alcohol to relieve the loneliness and unhappiness of being far from family and friends. Christmas was especially hard, resulting in an increase in suicides. Curious Historian states most dance hall girls drank only colored water with their customers. Unfortunately, however, some pimps and madams encouraged addiction as a means of controlling their girls. Only high-class madams kept strict rules about their girls' recreational use of drugs and alcohol. Famous female alcoholics included roustabout Calamity Jane, whom writer James D. McLaird found was drunk much of the time as she ran around the Wild West. Jane made a living any way she could, from working as a dance hall girl to playing the part of prostitute with a number of men. She also cooked on occasion, but it was her drunken escapades that caught the attention of newspapers and later historians. Then there was Celia Ann Maddie Blaylock, a working girl who became gunfighter Wyatt Earp's companion before he dumped her for actress and possible prostitute Josephine Marcus. According to Mark Nothaft at Arizona Central, Earp cast Maddie aside when she became addicted to laudanum for her migraines. Maddie went back to selling sex and later committed suicide.
Just a minute. I'm not finished with you yet. You know, at a distance, you'd almost pass for a man. But you're certainly a disappointment up close, aren't you?
Your feet, ma'am, are almost as big as your mouth.
Number 17. The Land of the Lonely. Before women arrived at the frontier, the Wild West was known as the Sad West, mainly because the towns were simply settlements that had tents and holes. Some holes to sleep in, and some to do their morning business. These towns were, in reality, simple work camps that had no sense of domestic life whatsoever, and these were the 1800s, which meant gender rules were quite strict. Without women, domestic life was a distant dream for these men. The situation was so bad that men would cross-dress to comfort each other, or they would spend a fortune getting their hands on a female's shorts or seeing a female's ankles. When the women arrived in the West, they witnessed a lot of desperate men, and they saw a clear financial opportunity. There was no society in the Wild West to judge these women, and they knew the overall demand for love was high, and they had to provide the supply as there was none.
Huh? But let me tell you something. We live in a terrible place and time. The American West is a disgusting, awful, dirty, dangerous place. Look around you. Everything out here that's not you wants to kill you. Outlaws, angry drunk people, scorned hookers, hungry animals, diseases, major and minor injuries, Indians, the weather. You can get killed just going to the bathroom. I take my life in my hands every time I walk out to my outhouse. There's fucking rattlesnakes all in the grass out there. And even if I make it...
Number 16. It was basically poison to use birth control. In an era of freewheeling attitudes, you might wonder why people weren't having as many babies. Condoms were available but very expensive, so many people relied on medications to end a pregnancy. These substances contained toxic ingredients, often from plant sources, that would end unwanted pregnancy upon arrival. For women engaging in this type of work, pregnancy was a major hazard. Not only could it end their careers, it was also life-threatening. In fact, many women on the frontier passed during childbirth. Women were often left with the choice of life-ending pregnancies or noxious substances to end an unwanted pregnancy. Unlike today, where safe sex is preached and practiced, the Wild West didn't use much protection. In fact, condoms were so expensive that people had to find other ways to prevent spreading of diseases and unwanted pregnancies. That's why prostitutes often used abortifacients, which had poisonous ingredients from plants that would often kill unwanted pregnancy once ingested. It's sad, but in the Wild West, many women had to decide whether to kill the baby or risk the high possibility of dying while giving birth. Number 15. for a better life. The saloon girl had many different names. The 49ers in California called them ladies of the line or sporting women. Cowboys called them soiled doves. Kansas trailers knew them by many names: daughters of sin, fallen frails, doves of the roost, and nymphs du prairie. Still others referred to the saloon girls as scarlet ladies, fallen angels, frail sisters, fair belles, and painted cats, to name a few. But they were all the same: saloon girls. Now, east of the Mississippi River, women didn't go in saloons, but the West was different. To the proper woman, there were two kinds of improper ones: saloon girls and prostitutes. And to this proper miss, these were lumped together and considered a necessary evil. But to saloon girls, what they did was vastly different than the prostitutes. Only in the roughest of saloons were the girls and prostitutes one and the same. Otherwise, saloon girls held themselves higher than the prostitutes and wouldn't be caught dead associating with one. So what exactly was the saloon girl? They were workers, hired by the saloon to entertain the lonely men. And men in the West tended to be lonely. They outnumbered the women 3-1 in most places. In California in the mid-1800s, the population was 90% male. The saloon girl's job was to dance with the men. They sang to them, talked to them, and otherwise kept them in the saloon buying drinks and playing games. Most of the girls had come west from farms and mills seeking a better life, the opportunities that the West had to offer. A great deal of them were widows who, without a husband to support them, had to work for a living. Unfortunately, the Victorian age didn't offer a great deal of employment opportunities for women. In fact, the men of culture acted like women were brainless. The only legitimate opportunities for a woman's employment were cooking, cleaning, or washing clothes. All backbreaking work. That's not to say that being a saloon girl was easy. A high probability of a violent death was a certain job hazard. Most of the ladies carried small pistols or daggers to protect themselves from overzealous patrons.
Ring the good old bugle, boys, we'll sing another song. Sing it with a spirit that will start the world along.
Number 14. America's oldest profession was in full swing. One thing is very clear about the Old West: sex workers were a staple to any town or city. What's surprising is the range of such options throughout the West. Some places were more stereotypical in terms of the treatment of those who worked within them. Others held this kind of work in higher regard, with expansive and elaborate spaces for workers to do business. This kind of work was also indicative of socioeconomic classes in Old West society. Most of these workers were young, 30 or younger, largely uneducated and, in many cases, illiterate. Some were immigrants, and pricing was based not only on looks, but also nationality and ethnicity. Like the anonymous, easily replaced miners and railroad workers of the American frontier, sex workers filled a social and economic function necessitated by capitalism, but, as individuals, were largely irrelevant and forgotten. The Wild West had lots of men and few women. Therefore, prostitution became the solution. Although illegal, prostitutes could be found in every town. There were madams who ran the brothels, high-class courtesans who catered to wealthy clients, and streetwalkers who earned money in the dark corners of the towns. Some prostitutes and madams became inspiration for novels and obtained legendary status in the folklore of the Wild West.
To stay away from my man. Bait! Take that back, you decrepit old bag!
Number 13. Painted ladies and their family. Though it may seem odd, many painted ladies were married, some to saloon owners or brothel operators. Others were married to managers of touring variety shows. Such men tolerated the profession and depended on their wives to help with the finances. Inevitably, painted ladies had children, though attempts were made at birth control, which was very primitive at the time. By the 1840s, women could purchase Portuguese female pills, an abortion pill, or Madame Restel's preventative powders, but it is unclear how effective these were. The French had already invented the condom, fashioned of rubber or skin as they are today. In places like New Orleans or St. Louis, where there was a large French population, condoms were readily available. However, much like today, many men were reluctant to use them. After 1860, diaphragms were available, and douches compounded from ingredients such as alum, pure lash, red rose leaves, carbolic acid, bicarbonate of soda, sulfate of zinc, vinegar, or plain water. Others simply relied on the rhythm method. But the most common form of birth control was abortion, which had also spread as a form of birth control to even respectable women. In the years between 1850 and 1870, one historian estimated that one abortion was performed for every 5 to 6 live births in America. If they were lucky, a courtesan would marry well and retire with enough money for a comfortable and respectable lifestyle. Those who married would normally become instantly respectable, as it was considered impolite in the Old West to ask for a person's background, and most people were too busy to care. Others used their profits to open their own sporting houses, become saloon operators, or practiced as abortionists. Inevitably, though, some often turned to alcohol or narcotics, dosing their drinks with laudanum or smoking opium.
Well, Frankie went down to the corner to pick up a bucket of beer.
Number 12. Ms. Silks' Untold Story. As one of the best-known madams in the West, Maddie Silks of Denver, Colorado, said, "I went into the sporting life for business reasons and for no other reason. It was a way for a woman in those days to make money, and I made it." Ms. Silks opened up her first brothel when she was 19 years old and made $38,000, equivalent to $1 million today, in just 3 months running a bordello in Dawson City, Alaska. Meanwhile, Fanny Porter's luxurious brothel in San Antonio, Texas, was a popular haunt of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, the most successful train robbing gang in history. Several of her girls, like Etta Place and Della Moore, went on to marry Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, and Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry.
Boy, you sure skinning them alive. I'd like to get to know you. You don't look very dangerous. You're even pretty. Say, that's a mighty big pile of winnings you got in front of you. Listen, ain't no one in this town plays poker better than me. Why not ditch these yokels and have a real game?
Number 11. There wasn't much education on the topic. There was no proper education on intimacy, which means not only did people not know enough about their parts, but they had no knowledge of STIs. Packets called marriage manuals were available to give some information in the late 1800s. However, in addition to being inaccurate, these packets stressed the importance of only engaging in the act within marriage. They also highlighted how self-given pleasure was unhealthy, because the use of a man's seed for anything other than procreation was frowned upon in the eyes of the Lord. If you wanted to know anything beyond that, you'd have to learn by doing.
This is the best one I got. Excuse me while I decide what to do with all my independence. Now, serving number 42.
Number 10. Not much was going on. Oral sex is awesome, but in the Wild West, there wasn't a whole lot of it happening. It's not as if it was something that wasn't around elsewhere in the world, but people in the Wild West actually seemed to think it was too European for their personal liking, which is why it wasn't going on. In fact, oral sex was so sparse that even prostitutes were against it, shunning other workers who performed it.
And the cure for alcoholism was said to be heroin. Thanks to technology, you didn't have to slum it at the opium den. You could get high at home. Take a trip out west to the frontier of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Number 9. Good women. The girls were encouraged to dance with the men, then get the men to buy them drinks. The men would pay regular price for the ladies' drinks, though the women would secretly serve cold tea or colored water. A practice my deputy husband tells me is still in use today. Who knew? The girls got a commission off the drinks and a set salary for the week. They were also discouraged from spending too much time with one patron, as the saloon owners lost a lot of employees to marriage. As I mentioned, the saloon girls were there to dance with the men. Dancing usually started at 8 or so in the evening. Each turn lasted about 15 minutes, and a popular girl could average as many as 50 dances a night. Oftentimes, they can make more a night than a working man could make in a month. Because of this, it was rare for them to double as a prostitute. In fact, many ladies of ill repute found they can make more money as a dance hall girl. Most saloon girls were considered good women by the men, and in most places, the women were treated as ladies. True, Western men tended to hold all women in high regard, but the saloon girls and/or the saloon keeper demanded respect. Any man who mistreated one of these women was quickly deemed an outcast. If he insulted one, he would most likely be shot and killed.
Really? What kind of lady are you? She's mine. I feel like a ditty. Little girl sing.
Number 8. Along come the madams. Enterprising women started up their own brothels. They were generally former prostitutes that had aged out of the business. There were definitely different levels of brothels. Some were just a couple of rooms shared by a few women. The high-end brothels were large, beautiful homes where each girl had her own lavishly furnished room. The women rented their rooms from the madam and paid her usually 50% of their take. Many madams became known for their philanthropic work. It was likely a madam that put up the money to build a school and a church in the town. Some would give their girls startup money for opening a store or restaurant. The madams played a vital role in the development of the Old West.
Hey, look at that.
Hey,
Look at that, mother.
Yeah,
Look at that. He's a desperado.
Is he a bad guy or a good guy?
I'm the bad guy. I'm the one that started the fight.
Oh, that was cute.
Then I ran and lived.
Number 7. A brothel story. Brothels were a common sight in frontier towns. Prostitution was technically illegal throughout the Old West in the 19th century, but that didn't seem to stop anybody. Lawmen were often few and far between. Laborers, miners, and itinerant workers were rough-and-tumble men. They sought a good time after a hard day's work, and they were willing to pay for it. The soiled doves and sportin' women who populated the brothels were happy to comply if it meant taking in big bucks. As the West was won, brothels became town centers in much the same way as saloons. Migrant laborers, cowboys, and outlaws alike gravitated to them. For a little hard-earned cash, pleasure was easy to find. The women who ran those establishments did big business. In fact, it was one of the only ways frontier women could make money and assert themselves in an otherwise male-dominated society. By the end of the 19th century, many boomtowns made no show of hiding their red light districts. In one infamous instance, the 1895 Traveler's Guide of Colorado explicitly listed out brothels operating in the state. Traveling men could pick out any establishment from 66 pages of information. It was like Yelp for the old days, with an adult angle. That's not to say the sex industry was healthy, of course. Countless women died from childbirth and venereal disease as a result of their work in brothels. Others were at the mercy of careless, violent, and sadistic men. In the best-case scenarios, some madams became extremely wealthy, but that was rare. More often, women were used for men's pleasure in these not-so-halcyon days on the frontier.
Now you come on over, my soiled dove.
The West is too wild for a frail woman like me.
Unhand her, you brute.
Oh!
Hey, what's the big idea?
I'm here to defend your honor. You girls are helpless out here in the West.
Ha! That's a good one.
Number 6. The Tale of the West's Madams. During the 1800s, jobs for women were extremely scarce. Ohio History Central confirms that women in general were expected to work in the home performing domestic chores, growing food, and caring for the children. Those who ventured into the working world were often relegated to roles like school teachers, making just over $80 a year according to QEMA. Laundresses, clerks, and factory workers. In the latter field, women were subject to awful pay and working conditions. A job in the prostitution industry, however, gave women independence and a way to make good money. An example is the celebrated courtesan Ah Toy in San Francisco during the 1850s. Writer Myra Rose Holman says that men paid an ounce of gold just to have a look at her. Of all the classes of prostitutes, streetwalkers, crib girls, common prostitutes, and even parlor house girls, being a madam was the most lucrative. Some, like Salida, Colorado Madam Laura Evans, loved to sing and dance and get drunk and have a good time, according to writer Emma R. Merrick. Alternatively, Denver Madam Maddie Silks explained that being a madam was a way for a woman to make money in those days, and I made it. Author Heather Brandsetter submits that the sex industry was indeed a needed service and even kept sex crimes at a minimum. In general, madams fell into three general categories. Some, like Helen Harbin of Carson City, Nevada, served as mere landlords over a brothel property. According to the Las Vegas Sun, Harbin inherited the brothel after her husband died. Although she never worked in the sex industry, she rented out the house to various madams. Likewise, Madam Laura Evans confirmed that when she began her career in Leadville, she rented a bordello from another madam, Lou Bunch. Later, Evans ran her own parlor house, but hired Lillian Powers to run her cribs, small two-room apartments in Salida, after Powers was run out of Cripple Creek by her own landlord, a French woman known as Leo the Lion. Evans, Bunch, and thousands of others often ran their own brothels. These were not common houses of prostitution attached to a saloon. Rather, the best madams operated out of fancy parlor houses where, according to Emma Merrick, the employees were boarders who lived and worked in the same house. The ladies paid about half of their earnings to the madam for room and board and were generally allowed to keep their tips. Prices at a parlor house could be anywhere from $10 per customer in the primitive mining towns to $50 in larger cities like Seattle and San Francisco.
Now, hold on. Prostitution is no job for a respectable woman like you.
Blaine, women, like everyone else, came to the West for economic opportunity. And despite its considerable downsides, prostitution was often the most lucrative line of work available to them.
And if you haven't noticed, it is the 1800s, and there aren't a lot of options for me to earn a living. This is the best one I got.
Number 5, the worst horror of all, pregnancy. One of the worst things a working girl could experience was an unwanted pregnancy, which put her out of work and made her business difficult. Boston University reported on one archaeological dig of a brothel which revealed syringes used to inject mercury, arsenic, and vinegar into the body to induce abortions or treat diseases. The owner of the house, Mrs. Lake, later married a doctor who also prescribed medicines for treating sexually transmitted diseases and inducing abortions. But the women's biggest hurdle was the Comstock Act of 1873, which not only banned birth control items and information, but also terminations. Thus, women had to come up with their own homemade remedies to keep from getting pregnant. The true number of infants produced by working girls in the Old West will never be known. Terminations were never reported because of the Comstock Act. Anne M. Butler wrote that stillborns and fetuses were often quietly disposed of or buried without record. In February of 1877, Mary Keene, along with Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Wicks, was charged in Laramie, Wyoming, for failing to provide a proper burial for a fetus. The child was probably Mary's. Other women, such as Laura Evans of Colorado, were able to raise their children, sometimes out of the prostitution realm. In an interview with her great-grandsons, the men verified Laura's daughter, Lucille, didn't talk about her mother, but just described her mother as being a landlady.
Prostitutes were very rarely called prostitutes, let alone whores, in the Old West. Most commonly they were referred to as the soiled doves, or the women of the sisterhood, or those of the demi-monde, the half-world, kind of the underworld.
Number 4, is marriage a viable option? The best a working girl could hope for was to marry and leave the profession for good. Emma R. Merrick cites a respectable woman named Mary Matthews of Colorado, who observed, "Sometimes a good citizen, wealthy and respectable, marries his wife from some of these corrupt houses, and he seldom ever regrets his choice. He builds her up to be respected and respectable. I have heard of several cases." Likewise, according to writers Vardis Fisher and Opal Laurel Holmes, Denver Madam Maddie Silks told others, "My girls made good wives. They understood men and how to treat them, and they were faithful to their husbands. So I knew they made good wives." Author Helen M. Lewis theorized men were willing to marry saloon girls and prostitutes largely due to the shortage of women in the early West. One of her sources cited the ratio of males to females as 10 to 1, while another guessed there were from 3 to 30 times as many unmarried men as unmarried women in the West. Therefore, any woman described as virgins, including aging spinsters, as well as widows, widows with children, divorcees, and prostitutes, were fair game. Still, some working girls were hesitant or even afraid to marry. In writing his memoirs of the gold rush, Tim Kernick recalled sweet-talking one of the dance hall girls, telling her about a nice farm in Indiana. But she said, "No, Tim, you would not want me when you get that farm."
Now that we got all this cash, let's do something with it. Cheryl, you open a store to shop in. Marta, you open a school to learn in. Donna, you open a church to feel guilty in.
And with all that wealth, they soon became leaders of their communities.
First you get the land, then you get the money, then you get the power.
And number 3, a tale about dance halls. Dance halls were not just venues for dancing. They were also places where people could meet and engage in flirtation, sometimes leading to more intimate connections. In the Old West, dance hall girls were hired in saloons as a form of entertainment for the men of the time. Not only was it a profitable way for the owners to sell more drinks, but also a way to help provide an entertaining evening for the lonely men. Although the men loved it, the upstanding women were very much against it and quite suspicious of their presence in the area. They considered the women that were employed by these saloon keepers as provocative women and called them many things, such as painted ladies, disgraceful, ladies of the night, and much more. The truth was, though, that most of them would never have even considered prostitution. It was just as degrading to them as it was to the women who were making that assumption about them. In the Old West, dance hall girls were hired in saloons as a form of entertainment for the men of that time. Not only was it a profitable way for the owners to sell more drinks, but also a way to help provide an entertaining evening for the lonely men. Although the men loved it, the upstanding women were very much against it and quite suspicious of their presence in the area. They considered the women that were employed by these saloon keepers as provocative women and called them many things such as painted ladies, disgraceful, ladies of the night, and much more. The truth was, though, that most of them would never have considered prostitution. It was just as degrading to them as it was to the women who were making that assumption about them. On the contrary, these dance hall girls were making good money without having to stoop to that level. They also got to dress up in bright, colored, ruffled skirts and petticoats, all decorated with fringe, sequins, lace, and other embellishments. Many would carry pistols or daggers on them for protection, hiding them in their bosom or inside their boots. They even wondered why the respectable women would choose the life of being a wife and mother who had to work so hard on the farm along with raising a family. Many of the girls came from farms or mills themselves. A lot of the dance hall girls did eventually become wives later in life, after they had saved their money and had nice little nest eggs. Number 2, the story of Belle Starr. Born to a well-to-do, Confederate sympathizing family, Myra Maybelle Shirley Starr, later known as Belle, and eventually the Bandit Queen, was a teenager in Cheyenne, Texas in 1864 when outlaws Jesse James and the Younger brothers used her family's home as a hideout. In the years that followed, Starr married 3 outlaws: Jim Reed in 1866, who ran with the Younger, James, and Starr gangs, and was killed in 1874 by police, Bruce Younger in 1878, and Sam Starr, a Cherokee, in 1880. After Belle and Sam Starr were later charged with horse stealing, a federal offense for which she served time, she was again charged with horse theft in 1886. This time, because of her legal skills, she was acquitted. But in the meantime, her husband and an Indian policeman had shot each other to death. Starr herself was murdered February 3, 1889 at the age of 40, close to her Oklahoma cabin in the Cherokee Nation. Some suspect her son, Ed Reed, whom the Texas State Historical Association asserts she had recently beaten for mistreating her horse. The crime has never been solved. 2 days following her death, the New York Times called her the most desperate woman that ever figured on the borders. But according to Glenn Shirley, author of Belle Starr and Her Times, The Literature, the Facts, and the Legends, the only truth in the report was the fact that she had died. Almost overnight, the name of Belle Starr became a household word throughout the nation, he writes. She had been elevated to a seat of immortal glory as a sex-crazed hellion with the morals of an alley cat, a harborer and consort of horse and cattle thieves, a petty blackmailer who dabbled in every crime from murder to the dark sin of incest, a female Robin Hood who robbed the rich to feed the poor, an exhibitionist and clever she-devil on horseback, and leader of the most bloodthirsty band of cutthroats in the American West. All this despite the lack of a contemporary account or court record to show that she ever held up a train, bank, or stagecoach, or killed anybody.
Attacked on the ground, right? Instead, we'll arrive from the roof. Now, for this job to succeed, we have to be completely silent, because a wrong step would bring Pinkerton's guards down on us like a ton of bricks, and we wouldn't have a chance. There must be no mistakes. We must do things carefully, and we'll make it. The plan will be a perfect success.
Number 1. The West suffers from a lack of women. According to the 1870 census, each of the western states, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming, showed a larger population of men versus women. The difference in numbers could be drastic. In the area of South Park, Colorado, during the late 1800s, the ratio was 10,519 men to just 91 women, per red light women of the Rocky Mountains. According to True West, men going west without their female companions were forced to share not just domestic duties, but also social activities. At dances, men would sometimes tie handkerchiefs on one arm to denote them as the female partner. Author and Old West researcher Deborah Hufford submits that same-sex relationships among men in the West were acceptable since there were so few women. Men working as farmers, loggers, miners, and ranchers in remote places found themselves with no other choice for romance. Sharing a small cabin with another man often meant sharing a bed, and there apparently was no shame in it. The exception being the rarely publicized sex crime. Dr. Thomas J. Knowles' article in the Social Science Journal tells of an 1885 incident in Denver, wherein an older man promised a young man room and board, only to rape him.
Morphine. The cowboy's drug of choice in the Wild West was plainly booze. No organized sports. The way that men would pass time would be to spend it in saloons.
Secrets revealed. Most fascinating to Beaudry and her students is what the recovered items reveal about 19th century prostitution. At the time, it was unusual for people to brush their teeth, suggesting these women took particular care with their appearance. For Johnson, the most interesting item found at the site was a bottle filled with copaiba oil, a natural remedy used at the time to treat stomach cancers and ulcers. She brought the bottle to Richard Lorson, now a CAS chemistry professor emeritus, who was able to extract residue from the bottle and run conclusive tests on it. The analysis revealed the type of medical treatments for venereal disease at the brothel, Johnson says. It is the only concrete evidence we have for that women were using to treat their conditions. Diane Gallagher, a PhD student specializing in archoparasitology, meaning she studies bugs in dirt, among other things, to identify what diseases may have affected a population, identified both roundworm and whipworm at the Paddleford home. These are very common parasites and show a household that was not heavily infected. It was similar to any urban household at that time, says Gallagher. Eichner's research found that prostitutes at other 19th century brothels used similar syringes to inject mercury, arsenic, and vinegar into the body to induce abortions or treat diseases. Working on his site has been one of my favorite projects, says Eichner. I plan on studying brothels in the Caribbean for my dissertation, and I will use this work as a jumping-off point. Progressive reformers wrote of brothels as dens of iniquity, vice, depravity, and filth. But yet in this site, we see a very high concern for personal hygiene and health, Beaudry says. This is understandable, given the inevitable side effects of the sex trade, which is conception, disease, that sort of thing. These findings are the reverse of shocking. They show that these women were making a living as best they could. Which story left you speechless? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more thrilling tales from the Wild West. Thanks for joining us on the Wild Side. And until next time, stay tuned.